You're listening to the Recovered Life Show.
Absolutely. Well, you know what? We have a great show. We're going to dive right into it. Two really amazing segments today. The first one, I love it. And we've got a really amazing guest on, Audrey
Yes.
Holst, who's the founder of Fortitude and Flow, a process which fuses movement and mindfulness to create sustainable action. And I have to tell you why I love this is the whole topic of the segment, Kristina, is perfectionism.
Mm-hmm. We had Audrey last week on one of our Recovered Life discussions for Clubhouse, and people asked for her to come back, and they asked for some of the information that she was so kind to share with us. So I'm very, very excited. And perfectionism, I think, is something that is run rampant in the recovered world. Right.
Yeah,
I mean, I think it's on every list. You know, the perfectionism drives some of our drinking, certainly drives our thinking after we pass that line and move into recovery or sobriety. And I think that her view on it is really, really beautiful.
Well, I can't wait to have her on. Let's bring her on let's bring her into the Recovered Life Lounge here. And how you doing, Audrey? How's it going? Thanks for joining the show.
Thanks so much for having me. I was hiking in snow this past weekend, so I'm in a different different place in the country than you are, but it was still a beautiful weekend. So things are good here.
Here we are. I'm sunbathing and oh no, so sorry, but it sounds like you had a beautiful time. You know, last week when I was able to meet you and listen to you, you had such a beautiful viewpoint on perfectionism. And I'm wondering if you could go into a little bit of it, because a lot of times in the recovery world, depending on which program you come through, if you come through a program, we look at character defects, and perfectionism is on top of every single list. I mean, I really have not met somebody in the recovery world, and I want to start with that question, and then I want to talk about the different types of perfectionism, if you would, and perhaps finish with a mindful exercise. But start with that, Audrey.
Yeah. So when I talk about perfectionism, I talk about it as it's a wired survival mechanism in our
Mm-hmm.
systems. So my background is in yoga and movement, mindfulness, meditation. That's what I've done for the last more than 16 years. I've been doing
Wow.
that. So my perspective is always from a physical perspective. So one of the things that is very common in perfectionism is trying to wrangle things with our minds. It's trying to
Mm-hmm.
figure it out, right? There's this very strong desire to figure it out. If I could figure it out, if I could understand it more, then I'll be able to, conquer it, wrestle it to the ground, right? There's a lot of metaphors that people will use. But it's one of those things that when I talk to a lot of perfectionists, they know all of the things, right? They have a lot of knowledge, they have a lot of understanding, they even have understanding of history, but they have this inability to create different action or to do things differently. And so that's where a lot of this embodied connection starts to come in and really create some sustainable change.
So you're saying it starts in the body in many ways. The solution starts in the body, right? And
Yes.
we don't look at it that way. We look at it as a thinking problem. It's something to overcome. I love the way that you described that. One thing that I learned from you, and I think that our viewers will be very interested, is, I always had this idea that if you looked at my desk, there's no way I'm a perfectionist. And you shared some very interesting archetypes about perfectionism. And if you have a minute to share them, I think it would be amazing for people to see themselves, because there's probably people out there just like me saying, oh, no way I could be a perfectionist. Look at my desk.
Yeah, and that is a really common misconception about perfectionism, is that there's one particular way it looks, and that's the kind of traditional or classic perfectionist where everything is in a row and everything is aligned and everything has its place and everything looks and feels and is perfect. And I've had so many conversations with people who kind of joke about it. People will call themselves literally recovering perfectionists in that context, right? And they'll say, I never really thought of myself as a perfectionist because I couldn't do perfectionism perfectly enough, right? So there's different ways it shows up. And, depending on we talk about changing perfectionism through the body, but perfectionism was actually born in the body, right? It came through us. It's in our systems. A lot of us, it is hereditary. It's something that is kind of comes through in our genes. It comes through conditioning, right? Through how we are raised or experiences we've had in our lives or things that have been reinforced. So there are perfectionists, like we can talk about the optics perfectionist. This is a perfectionist that tends to put on a very particular front. So this is somebody who visually, how they show up, how they look, how they dress, how they take care of themselves, their workout routines. They have a very specific facade that they are presenting to the world, which can be a very particular kind of perfectionism. The strengths of that is that these people often throw great parties and look amazing and have a really strong value around aesthetics and taking care of that part of their lives and in other people's lives also. But it can also be very isolating because people don't actually get a chance to see the real them because they're always putting up a particular front. So depending on how you relate to perfectionism, where it shows up in your life, it may not be a blanket overview in every aspect.
That is really interesting. I think that I relate to that one, but I remember when you talked about all of them, I related to every single one of them. It's,
Yeah.
it's something that we find in the recovery world a lot, and the I can't say the word right this minute, but the difference between what we're trying to portray and what's happening on the inside is one of the things that would keep me, using and abusing substances. And then codependent behaviors were all over that. And so I love the idea that you're sharing that it comes from not only in our genes, because we know about epigenetics, we know what stress does, we know what trauma does, but it's also part of our environment. What is another archetype?
Another archetype, and I also want to mention too I did a series of interviews with the perfectionism interviews where I had over
Yes.
60 hours, right? 60 hours of conversations with perfectionists, and there were some common pieces. And one of the big pieces, the one that you just mentioned, was that piece of when I was asking people to share their stories. It was like, okay, what are people seeing on the outside versus what are you experiencing on the inside? And so often there was that conflict of how I felt was a completely different story than what other people were seeing. So there is this lack of understanding of what a person's inner world may be versus what they're showing to the outside world. So I just want to validate that for sure. One of the other, the hero perfectionist is a really classic example of perfectionism. And that's the sort of classic over functioner, right? That's the person who is going to sweep in and save and has it all handled. And it's all, it's fine all the time. And I got it and I got it and I got it. Meanwhile, one of the descriptions that a client gave was, I feel like a tractor trailer that's got like 15 trailers behind me. And as long as I'm on a straight path, things are fine. But if I have to swerve to avoid something in the road, then it's absolute chaos. So, that's another way that people may be experiencing how things
Absolutely.
are.
Audrey, I have a quick question for you here about this perfectionism thing, and I'd like you to elaborate a little bit on this.
Sure.
So I love you're talking about the inside and outside of perfectionism. So, I find, as being somebody who's a perfectionist myself, I find a
bit.
lot of the times the inside dialogue will be way different than what people see, right? Like, so I might say, wow, I just didn't get enough done this week. And, I've had friends say, you did more this week than I did in a year, right? Like this illusion that we really can't see that. Where does that come from? And how do you fix that? If somebody's listening to this and is a total perfectionist, how do you kind of start doing a different inner dialogue?
Totally. And I love that there's this impossible standards. And that's another thing that came up a lot is when I was talking about people's history, because this is the other thing, right? Very often with perfectionism, it's not like somebody just decided that, at age 30, you know what? I've never tried that perfectionism thing. I'm going to give that a go. This is kind of a theme that's in some way has weaved its way through a lot of our lives. And that was a consistency that I found when I was asking people to tell their stories. So having these impossible standards, that's one of those things that people, I'm not going to do this at 80%. I'm going to do this at 110%. And even then I'm going to feel unsatisfied with that 110%, right? I could have done better. It could have been more. And also the perfectionist two-step is to see it and fix it. Right. So people who are listening are going to be like, well, I want to fix this, right? I want to get this handled right now. Like, give me the answer. So that's one of the things with perfectionism is it takes these tiny, small and doable experimental steps. Cause you're actually, like I'm talking about the body piece, right? You're actually starting to reorient your body's orientation, right? You're starting to change the orientation in your body and how your nervous system is wired, what your body considers essentially a threat and what your body considers, oh, this is actually normal. This is okay. So a lot of the stuff that we start with is starting to notice and experiment with things like you're talking about. Okay, well, for some people, they may start to take actions that are 80% of like their best. And they
Right.
start to be like, okay, what if this is like, I think it was actually Kristina, maybe you were talking about Michelle talking about like the B plus work, right?
Yes, yes. It's
And
such a great concept.
people start to not do the A plus plus work in every aspect of their lives, but maybe they try a little bit of B plus work in certain areas where it feels a little bit less risky. And the effect, the internal feeling, and even the words that people will use will be like, I didn't die, right? I tried something different and I didn't die. And actually, I saved some energy and I feel slightly different. So these are the things that start to integrate in the system
Right.
as slight changes.
You did hear that, Damon, right?
I did, but
You know,
it's
you
funny.
did the classic
I
two-step right on her.
I did. Christina knows that I'm a bit of a perfectionist, and here's a funny thing that I noticed. Even though it will bug me, like I'm a ruminator. Audrey, like we just met, but I'm a ruminator. So
Mhm.
I will maybe do the B plus work, but then later I was like, I could have done that better. Why didn't I think of this? Why did this whole thing about perfectionism? I have to ask you about this because perfectionism and addiction, those two things are married. A lot of people, it's like a sense of control, right? Like I don't have control over things, so I have to assert control. What's with the deal with control and perfectionism? Is there an element of control in there?
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. There's some sort of control. And it even when we're taking actions that we don't necessarily want to do, there's still there's still an aspect of control. And I think that one of the things that you were talking about, right, that rumination, that's a very common thing. Again, this is a head centered thing, right? The thinking and the paying attention to the thoughts, which is why a lot of the work that I do starts to orient people to different aspects of themselves as a human being beyond their thoughts, right? The physicality of their bodies, the sensations of interacting with the physical world, what it's like to be them as a physical human moving through the world, because we're so used to wrangling stuff with our heads that we forget that there's this entire world that communicates actually from the bottom up also in our body. So when we start to have influence and understanding of what happens from the neck down, right, we're very oriented towards like, if I change everything in my brain, then that affects the rest of my body. Well, it actually works in the opposite direction
Right.
also. If you start to influence what's happening in your body, that also communicates upstairs. So this is one of the reasons that I started to understand things differently. Is I was one of those people that tried to wrangle my thoughts. I was terrible at it. And the worse I was at it, the worse I felt about myself, because I was like, well, there's got to be
Right.
something wrong with me that I can't wrangle my thoughts perfectly,
Right.
right? So that's where I started to take a different approach and from this body-centered background and start to do things that way as opposed to just trying to wrangle them mentally.
You know, Audrey, I know you work with a lot of professionals and high stress individuals. Is that how you start them, with the orientation? Because we have discussed, you and I, prior to about the nervous system.
Yes.
And if your nervous system is in alarm, there is no access to your prefrontal cortex. There's no ability. And through my work with autism, I discovered that this made a huge difference with my son, and then started to use those same techniques for me. And
Yes.
so I'm curious because how do you tell? I know you work with a lot of attorneys. How do you start that conversation, and how can we start that conversation with ourselves?
Yeah, a lot of it is just an understanding and an education of how we think about our bodies, right? How we think about how we're built as human beings, because like I said, there's this lot of perception of if I can only understand it or think it differently, then I can change the whole system. But we have to understand that we are wired in a way that often we don't have conscious influence in the beginning things are
Mhm.
firing in our system because our body wants to be efficient, right? Our body
Mhm.
wants to be efficient to save energy, to save calories, to do things in the most easy way. So there's always an anticipation of what it thinks is going to happen next. So it wants to stay in those grooves. It wants to do those grooves. So in the beginning, jumping out of those grooves feels weird, feels awkward, feels wrong. And that's the other thing I want to point out is in the beginning, when we start to make these changes, when we start to change our orientation, our actions in different ways, it's going to feel uncomfortable. It may even feel like is this right? This kind of feels awkward. It maybe feels wrong. That's normal in the beginning, just because it so-called feels wrong. It's
Mhm.
different than what you're used to. So things are starting to shift differently. So a lot of in the beginning is just starting to get people to see and experience themselves in a different way.
I love the thinking thing, Audrey. I got you because this whole thing about this, if I could only outthink it, this is so tied into people who have addiction personality because they think, well, if only I could get past this, if only I could do this, if only I could do that, then I can outthink this. Even when the data is there, it's like, you can't unthink it. You've done the best that you can. Now you have to let it go. Like, how do you tell people, what's the solution here with letting go? Is it as easy perfectionism to drop as just to say, hey, don't be a perfectionist anymore?
If it was that easy, everybody be doing it, right? Like that's the that's the deal. Yeah, no, what it requires is creating new history, right? We all have this history in our bodies, in our minds, in our memories, in our perceptions of what has happened in the past and what we anticipate will happen in the future, right? That's one of the things that happens with perfectionism a lot is this prediction of what is going to go wrong and how do I keep it from going wrong in the future, right? How am I going to stop that from happening? Well, often it's avoiding. I'm just going to avoid it. I'm not going to touch it. I'm not going to go near it.
Yeah.
Or I'm going to just have anxious, I'll just be anxious about it the entire time and worry about the entire time. And that feels productive, right? My anxiety feels productive. Like that's the right thing to be doing. So it is just as small and tiny things. And one of the things we talked about, Kristina and I talked about, was just this doing these exercises where we get out of the head and the thinking, and we start to orient to our physical environment, which is how we're built. We're built to be oriented to our physical environment. We're built to be oriented to our physical selves. We're built to be oriented to the social network, right? Our social nervous system and being connected with other people. This is actually how we are built. So starting to those muscles that have gotten atrophied from perfectionism, because perfectionism isolates, it tells us these lies about who we are and what we have to do, starting to tap back into how we are actually built as human beings and starting to try some different techniques makes a huge difference.
But you do feel awkward, right? In the beginning, it
Of
feels
course,
awkward.
because you're
And
literally, that's the whole thing, right? You're literally rewiring all of these hormones that are used to firing in a certain way, or all of a sudden like, what's going on?
right.
This is not what we do. This is not efficient, right? We've got this highway we've been using this whole time. And so when you have orientation towards, even certain things we call like victim mindset or feeling guilty, right? We have an orientation towards that because we're used to it. So
Right.
getting away from those things takes practice.
Well, that is amazing. I want to really quickly talk about the hero and the tie between codependency, because when you brought that up, I think a lot of our people will see that, wow, I never labeled it as perfectionism. I labeled it as saving someone. I labeled it as, keeping control over people. I labeled it, in many different ways. But if somebody's feeling like a hero, it really means, in codependency, we really learn that we're telling other people we know how to do it better than you,
Right.
and
Right.
we're really actually trying to control them so that we feel safe. Have you
Right.
found that to be true with the heroes that identify under perfectionism?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting when I'll be kind of listening to somebody, telling their story about this thing that happened, and it's always, it's so interesting. It's very easy to see from the outside,
Right.
but it's very difficult to recognize that from the inside sometimes. And a lot of that too, I will talk about the physical practices of being forward in other people's worlds and really being oriented to other people's worlds versus sitting back and being oriented to our own bodies and our own nervous systems and just noticing that these two things are interacting with each other. One of the phrases that I'll talk about with one particular client, right? Everybody, we kind of have our ways of speaking about things. It's like, you don't have to be kumbaya with everybody. You know, like it doesn't have to be a kumbaya with everybody. That's just naturally, you know, that's just not going to happen. So how do you be in yourself in relationship to somebody else that you may or not be kumbaya with? And how do you feel that distinction, right? How do you stay in yourself in relationship to another person? Because again, consent. Has this person consented you to be all up in their business? I don't know. Not sure. Maybe
Generally not.
generally
Well,
not.
generally not. I haven't really, maybe your child, but no, most of the time, no, even them.
Totally.
Well, thank you so much for coming on. How can people find you, Audrey? I
Yeah.
know
So
as I say, I know we have a link on Recovered Life,
mhm.
info at recoveredlife.us, but how can they find you outside of that?
Yeah, so my website, fortitudeandflow.com. If you want to learn more about these perfectionist archetypes, if you go to fortitudeandflow.com/perfectionist, you can check that out. It's a free guide. You can check out all the different archetypes, and I talk about the fortitude and flow process, a step that you can take to start to
Beautiful.
create some change for your particular archetype. So that's the best way for people to connect with me. And I'm on LinkedIn also. You know, I'm all up on there, and I'm always posting articles on perfectionism and all the most recent studies, which is always so interesting.
Thank you so much for coming on the show, Audrey. I know I've learned a lot about perfectionism myself because I could be a bit of a perfectionist. I talk with Kristina about that all the time. Thanks so much for joining us on the Recovered Life show today. We really appreciate it. Everybody, please go to info.recoveredlife.us. We have a full little bio there on Audrey, and you can access her on our website. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thanks so much for having me. This is great.